Well, good morning. I want to extend the welcome to everyone who's here, and especially to our visitors and those joining us over live stream. And it's especially good for me this morning. I'm just really thankful to be back. I was away for a little bit, and some of you maybe didn't notice, but a couple of you came up and you said, well, "Hey, you've been missing. Where have you been?" I didn't skip. I didn't leave or flee or anything. I'm not moving away. Just went on vacation for a little bit with my family, and back here this morning. And it's great to be here and to see you again and get to worship with you again. On that vacation, we went up to the coast of Maine to Acadia National Park, and if you've ever been there, it is one of the most beautiful places. It's super underrated. If you are checking off national parks, I would put that one very high on your list. And while we were there, we were hiking through these trails, and it's a part of the country where you have sort of these steep, mountainous regions, but these steep cliffs that drop off right into the ocean. So it's just beautiful where you get the mountains and the sea, best of both worlds. And as we're hiking along, there are these parts that kind of jet out into the water. So you can kind of go from one cliff out to another and kind of drop down till you get to the lowest part to where you're almost just on this peninsula with sort of the waves crashing in. And it was one of those moments where you are just overwhelmed with awe at God's creation and with gratitude and thankfulness. I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but I hear that that's that experience where you have these moments in nature, in creation, where you are just brought to praise and thanksgiving to God. And that was one of those moments for me. And as I'm there, I'm thanking God for the beauty of his creation and how wonderful and amazing it is. Thankful for the time that I've had with my family, getting to be with them after not always getting to see them as much as maybe I'd like to. And thanking God for you. I was thinking about Lost River in this moment where I'm just thanking God for the people that he's put in my life, for all of his creation, but especially for where he's placed me in it and the people that he surrounded me with, and for what's going on here, and that I get to be a part of this family. So I'm very thankful to be back. I love Maine, but I can say in all honesty, there is no place that I would rather be than here and with you. So I'm glad to be able to do that this morning. One other thing I want to share from that trip is we were in Maine for a little bit, then we dropped back down to Boston. And Boston is just this amazing city. It's a very walkable city, which is kind of fun. Houston was not that way where I grew up, but Boston is a very walkable city. You can go all through the streets, and there's so much. I mean, everywhere you look, you are just hit with so much history. And there's history of the Revolution and of the Kennedys and of, sort of the very founding of our nation. And what's interesting about some of these figures that we would read about, or that we would, there was a graveyard with these different men who were buried there, who were key figures to sort of the founding of our nation. And what's interesting about a lot of these figures is they have whole biographies written of their life. Their entire life story is written out in 400, 500 pages, and on the cover of that is sort of a summary statement of who they are and the life that they lived. So for a few examples, the author of America is the biography of Thomas Jefferson. An Unfinished Life is the biography of John F. Kennedy. And then one that I didn't see this one in Boston, but I just came across it as I was thinking about this lesson. One of the most interesting ones to me was it's the title "Bound for the Promised Land," and that's the biography of Harriet Tubman. So it's interesting. You have these people, these amazing figures, and their whole life is written within this biography. But then on the front, it's just this summation of who they are. Their character in one word or one phrase that describes their life. And it got me to thinking, okay, if someone were to write that about me, or let's say if Jesus was to write out the story of my life, what would he put on the cover? We have some examples of that in the Bible. Abraham is a friend of God. That's sort of a summary statement of his life. Or David, a man after God's own heart. But what would Jesus put on your cover? What would that phrase or statement be that summarizes your life? There's one man in the New Testament who we know hardly anything about. We don't know his backstory. We don't get the full biography of this man. He wasn't as notable as a David or an Abraham or really even any of the major historical figures. But Jesus summarizes his life in a very powerful statement that I hope could be said of me, and I hope that would be true of us. And that's when Jesus writes to the church of Pergamum in the book of Revelation, and he says this. He says, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. I know you're in a terribly difficult situation, and in this moment, persecution had arisen. And that was what they're struggling with. And he says, I know where you dwell. And he says, yet you hold fast to my name. And you did not deny my faith, even in the days of, here's our phrase, Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. We don't know anything else about the backstory of this man. We don't get the full biography, but we know what we do know about him are these three words that Jesus uses to describe his whole life story, and that is Antipas, my faithful witness. And this morning, the question that I want us to ask is simply this: what would it mean for you? What would it mean for you to live your life as God's faithful witness? And to answer that, we're going to come back to the book of Revelation toward the end of this lesson. But what I want to do is I just want us to look into that word witness and see how it can be traced throughout the larger biblical story, and then what it says for our lives today and how this can be true of our life story. Normally when we think about the word witness, we usually think of it in kind of like a legal setting, a sort of a courtroom. So a crime has been committed, and so you call on a witness to testify what they saw or what they experienced or what they know to be true. And so maybe we can give an example. This isn't exactly in a courtroom, but say you're at school and someone stole your lunch money. And so you go to the teacher and you say, hey, somebody stole my lunch money. Or maybe you saw the kid and you said, that's the kid who stole my lunch money. Well, the teacher is probably going to say, okay, well, did anyone else see it? Do you have any evidence? Do you have any witnesses? Or they probably wouldn't call him a witness, but do you have anyone else who can testify, who can agree to your statement that this was the person who did it? Or we could flip it around, right? Maybe you're the one who's accused of stealing the lunch money. And so you're brought before the teacher with this accusation, and you say, no, I didn't do it. And to plead your case, you might bring over a friend who saw you in another place, another time, or who saw that you definitely did not do this. So you call them over, and you hope that this person will be a faithful witness, that they'll tell the truth about who you are. That way you can clear your name of defamation and slander before your classmates. That's what a faithful witness is, someone who can testify to the truth. And it's not just about testifying to the truth, but in that moment, say, taking that same example, you also hope that they're not just going to tell the truth, but that they are trustworthy in the eyes of the teacher, right? That the teacher is actually going to believe, like, this isn't a mischievous kid. I actually am going to believe this person's testimony, that what they're saying is true. So witness, being a faithful witness, is not just about telling what you have seen or experienced, what you know to be true, but also about your character. And here's the thing, to not have a faithful witness can be a really serious thing. Right? Maybe in the context of someone stealing your lunch money or you being accused of that, that's not that big of a deal, right? But imagine that your character really is on the line, and the decision is life-altering. In that scenario, what you need is a faithful witness, someone who will tell the truth about who you are and your character and your nature. You need someone who will represent you as a faithful witness. Now, we'll come back to that idea in a moment, but what I want us to see is how this fits in with the biblical story. And a lot of times the word witness, as we kind of do this word study for a second, this word witness is used in that same way, in kind of a legal setting. So for example, Boaz, when he agrees to be the kinsman redeemer for Ruth and Naomi's family, he calls together witnesses, people who were prominent leaders within the city. He calls them so that they can testify to what they see if any kind of disagreement later arises. So he calls together these witnesses to show that, yes, I am the kinsman redeemer for Ruth and her family. But the way that this idea of witness, the way that it's used is not just in this legal setting, but it goes beyond that. And what we see is that creation bears witness. So we see this in Romans 1, where Paul writes that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from the things that have been made, so that people are without excuse. So nature was created, at least in part, for the purpose of being a witness to God, of bearing witness to his divine power and his eternal power and divine nature, to describe who God is in a clear and compelling way. And we experience that. I experienced that when I went to Maine and saw God's creation, and you've experienced that too. Nature acts as a witness to who God is. But it's not just nature, it's not just creation that is made for that purpose, but humanity. Humanity is seen as God's chief witness. And you see this in the very beginning. There in Genesis, as God creates the world, it says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image.'" And so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over it." And so here's, from the beginning, this idea of a witness. Being an image bearer of God is about bearing witness to who he is, to represent him as the image bearer within God's creation, to represent his nature, to represent his character, to rule over the world in the same way that he would. It's to represent him. It's to be his witness. And so we see this throughout the biblical story. And what's interesting about that is within this creation narrative, we see that with all these things that God makes, it's good, right? It's good. After each day, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. But then after he creates man and it's brought to completion, what does he say? It's very good. And it's like nature acts as a witness and bears testimony to who God is, but the chief witness is humanity. It's you and me. Humanity was made to be God's faithful witness. Or we could say it like this: God created humanity as the chief witness to who he is. And this becomes a dominant theme throughout the Bible. You see it in people like Noah or Abraham, but perhaps the place that it comes through most clearly is in the story of Israel in Exodus 19. And there in Exodus 19, what has happened? Well, for 400 years, Israel was enslaved to the oppressive powers of Egypt. But God remembered his covenant to Abraham. He remembered his desire and promises toward the people of Israel. And so he comes and he rescues them. He redeems them out of the house of slavery, and he brings them to the foot of this mountain. And there God says this: with all the people gathered around, this nation of slaves, he says, you yourselves have seen. Right? Remember, a witness is the one who testifies about what they have seen. And he says, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. I love how God's described there, that this one who bears us up on eagle's wings, who rescues the people and brings them where not just out of the house of slavery, not just into the promised land, but he's brought them to himself. And he says, you've seen this. And he says, now therefore, because you've seen this, because you've witnessed this, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Those two phrases, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, what do those phrases mean? A priest is one who represents who God is to the people. That was the very purpose of the priesthood, right? This tribe of Levi. Everything about the way that they live and act and work in the world, everything from the way they dress and talk and eat, in the festivals that they celebrate, everything about who they were was to represent who God is to the people. And God's desire is not just that there would be this specific, limited, exclusive group of people who represent who he is, but a kingdom of priests, an entire nation of people who would represent who he is to the rest of the world. And so he says, you're going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And by entering into that covenant relationship, they would come to know who God is and then make him known to the rest of the world. In other words, it is about being God's faithful witness. Now, I want us to think for a second about what God's doing in this moment. God's calling for a witness. He's looking out among the world. He's looking out among all the peoples of the world. And he's looking for a witness, someone to testify about the truth of who he is, to represent him to the world. And who does he choose? He doesn't choose the global superpower. He doesn't choose a culture that already has an established law and custom. He doesn't choose the nation that has glory and renown already. Instead, who's at the foot of this mountain? Slaves. They have no custom, they have no culture, they have no law or government. They're slaves. And yet God says, it's through you that I will make myself known. You will be my faithful witness. And the question that we might ask is, well, how did that go? And the answer is, well, not super great. Because what happens right after this moment, right? Aaron, the high priest, the one who is supposed to be the ultimate representative of God, the ultimate witness of who God is to the people, what does he do? He takes all of the gold and the silver and the jewelry of the people and he melts it down and they reshape it and refashion it into the likeness of this golden calf and they worship it as an idol, saying this is the God who has saved them. And immediately as the reader, we're struck to ask, like, how could this happen? And how is God ever going to use that? How is God ever going to use this people to be his faithful witness? And certainly they have high points throughout their history, particularly the days of David and Solomon, where the nations do come and see the glory of God. But by the time that they are finally taken captive by Babylon in 586 BC, they are a nation who looks entirely different from who God called them to be. And instead of being that kingdom of priests and that holy nation, they had become just like the nations around them. The same idols, the same practices, the same life. And you think maybe using the slave people was not such a good idea. Or maybe the real lesson is maybe using humanity at all wasn't such a good idea. Because through the story of Israel, we see humanity's failure, all humanity's failure to be God's faithful witness. And listen to what God has to say about this in Isaiah 43. In Isaiah 43 in verse 8, God says, bring out the people. Bring out the people who are blind yet have eyes, who are deaf yet have ears. And he says, gather all the nations together and all the peoples assemble, and let them bring their witnesses to prove them right. And let them hear and say, it is true. All right, so here's the scene. It's sort of this law court scene. And on one hand, on one side, we have these people who are coming out and they're deaf and they're blind. And then on the other side, you have all the nations coming. And the question is, who will represent who God is? Who will bear witness and give testimony to the nature of God? And he looks to Israel and he says this, you are my witnesses. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. So in this setting with the blind and the deaf gathered and all the nations who have come together and assembled to hear the witness of God, God says, you are my witnesses. And what's the glaring problem about this? They're blind and deaf. Not exactly the kind of person you want representing you as a witness. Right? Imagine being in a court scene and the witness who they call in is blind and deaf and not to that almost sounds like rude or something, but this is the picture that God is painting. This is the witness that he has to work with. And how is God ever going to do that? But in this scene, God begins to talk about something is going to change. Something's going to happen. And he talks about how God is going to raise up a truly faithful witness, a servant who through whom God will change Israel and restore Israel. And here's what he says a few chapters later. He says, and now the Lord says, he who formed me, this is the servant speaking. He who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. And he says, I will make you a light for the nations. The nation that was blind and deaf, the nation of slaves, is going to become a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Kings shall see and arise, princes shall bow down because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you. So you see what's happening here? The nation that was blind and deaf, something's going to change. Something's going to happen. They're going to become a light to the nations, that God's salvation will reach the ends of the earth. Or, as he'll say again a few chapters later in Isaiah, incline your ear and come to me and hear, that your soul may live. And I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Behold, he says, remember, don't forget what this scene was. I made him a witness. I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. And behold, in the same way that I made David a witness to the nations, you shall call a nation that you do not know, and a nation that you do not know shall run to you, because the Lord your God and the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. So here's the picture. After all this history of Israel, who was called to be the faithful witness and failed time and time again and has lost their credibility, God says, you're going to be glorified again. And I'm going to remake you into my faithful witness. And the question is, okay, how is that going to happen? How's God going to do this? And that's when we come back to the book of Revelation and the story of Jesus. And there in Revelation 1, the Apostle John writes this. And this is so amazing. He says, "Grace to you and peace. From Jesus Christ," he says, "the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, the ruler of the kings of the earth. To him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood and made us a kingdom and priests to God his Father. To him be the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen." Do you see what John is saying in this moment? Jesus is the faithful witness. And by his life and by his death and by his resurrection and ascension into glory, he became the faithful witness, the ultimate representation of who God is to the world. Just like we talked about this morning, that in Jesus is the fullness of God is experienced and seen, that when he drew near, all mankind could see who God really is. His nature, his character is on full display in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And when he came, what happened? He made us into a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. In other words, he took a people who were slaves. He took a people who were blind and deaf and who had hardened hearts by sin. He redeemed them and he turned them into God's faithful witness, so that his salvation could reach the ends of the earth. Or in the words of Jesus from Acts 1, when he says just before his ascension into glory, he says to his apostles, and I believe by extension to you and me today, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and even to the ends of the earth." And that's exactly what they did. They went about in Peter on the day of Pentecost. He stands up as God's faithful witness and he testifies to the truth about who Jesus was. And when the church first meets its opposition, the same apostles say, "We cannot stop speaking about what we have seen, about what we have heard. We're just witnesses and we can't help but share our testimony and share what we know to be true." And men and women all throughout the ancient world do this exact same thing. Men and women like Antipas, who gave his life as a faithful witness of Jesus. In fact, the word witness in the New Testament is the word martus, where we get the word martyr. And just as Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church, that through these faithful witnesses who were so faithful that they would even give their life for the testimony about who God is to the world. Through their life, through their witness, the church grew and did in fact reach the ends of the earth and reaches you and me today. And so what would it mean for you? What would it mean for you to live your life as God's faithful witness? I think maybe it starts with this. I think it starts when we see your salvation in Jesus. See your salvation in Jesus. Do you remember the first thing that God said to the people of Israel when they came to the foot of that mountain? You yourselves have seen. You yourselves have seen. But what happened by the end of their story, you remember, is they became blind and deaf. And of course, that's not literal, but it describes their character. They had overlooked the salvation of God. They had stopped listening to his voice. They had tuned out the words of the Lord and forgotten what he had done for them. They had forgotten the salvation that had come by God's grace. And sometimes I wonder if the same thing happens to us, where we come here and we know the story. We know of God's salvation. We've seen it and we've heard it, but have we kind of become blind to it? Have we kind of tuned it out? Have we heard the story so many times that it just has kind of become old news to us? Because that's what happened with Israel. And here's why that's so important. You will never be a witness of God to others. You will never be a witness of God's redemption until you truly believe that God has redeemed you. You will never be able to give your faithful witness and testimony and tell of who God is to the world and the redemption that you found in him until you are fully convinced on the deepest of levels that God has in fact redeemed even you. And until that becomes real to us, that testimony will never come. But on the other hand, when our eyes are open to it, or I love the way that Paul puts it, when the eyes of our heart are enlightened, when the eyes of our heart are enlightened to truly grasp and comprehend the love of Christ, that it's not just a story we've heard so many times that we overlook it or that we've begun to tune it out, but it's a story that grips us within the deepest core of our being when it truly becomes that real to us. No more powerful witness could be spoken than when I truly believe and see the salvation in Jesus. And so I think it starts with this, seeing our salvation in Jesus. But then the second thing of being a faithful witness is to set your life apart for him. When Israel was at Mount Sinai, God called them to be that kingdom of priests, that holy nation where everything about who they were, their customs, their festivals, the way they ate, drank, talked, everything about what they did was to be set apart so that God would be known to the nations through them. But what had happened by the end of their story is they had become just like the nations around them. In fact, the prophets argue that they were even worse. And their witness was ruined. And if we're going to be a faithful witness, this is the challenge for us. It kind of reminds me of when you're playing sports and you get to that age where you can finally get your name on the back of your jersey. And from that time, you are representing your family. You're representing your family name for better or for worse. And the greatest way that you and I could ruin our witness for Jesus is to wear that name Christian on our back and then live a life that looks nothing like him. But on the other hand, when we live a life that is set apart for God, when we represent him in the way that we talk and act and think in the entertainment that we take in every aspect of our life is set apart for him, there is no stronger testimony than a life that's fully set apart for God. And so set your life apart for him. But then the last thing about being a faithful witness is this. You have to say it. Share your witness with the world. When God called them to be that kingdom of priests and that holy nation, why did he do that? Was it just to have this exclusive special relationship with them? No, it was so that by this covenant relationship, they would come to know who God is and then make him known to the rest of the world. And that's what being a faithful witness is all about. And I love the way that Peter puts this, and this is the last passage that we'll read. He says, you, speaking of us, you are a chosen people. You are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of the darkness and into his marvelous light. So Peter, he says it's not just that God rescued you from slavery and brought you into freedom, but he's brought you out of darkness, out of uncreated chaos, and he's brought you to life and light. And because of that, he says, proclaim it. Can you proclaim the excellencies of God without your words? I think the answer is yes. But the word proclaim literally means to tell out loud. To tell out loud. And sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves because we worry about how that's going to come across in figuring out all the right words to say when we tell about who God is. But we do this all the time. When you're a kid, you proclaim the excellencies of your dad. You talk about how great your dad is and how your dad's better than all the other dads. Or when you're older and you find that special someone, you proclaim the excellencies of them, sometimes to the point where it probably gets annoying to people. But you proclaim their excellencies. Why? Because you're in awe and you love them. And when you're older and you have that child or that grandchild, what do? You proclaim the excellencies of them to everybody that you meet. You show them pictures. And he says, proclaim the excellencies of God. Tell about him. Tell about how he's changed you. Tell about how he's redeemed you. Tell about the people that he's brought into your life. Tell about the joy and the love and the assurance and the hope that you have because of him. Share your witness with the world. Because this is what you were created for. This is the purpose for which you were made. This is the reason that God redeemed you by the blood of his son. This is the reason he called you out of the darkness and into the marvelous light, that you would be a faithful witness. And I pray that those words be true of our life story today. If you're here this morning and you've yet to experience the redemption of God, who's come to rescue you and make you his own and bring you to himself and make you into that faithful witness, we hope that you'll consider that this morning. Or if we can help you in any way, we hope that you'll make that known in the days to come or right now as together we stand and sing.